Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast. I'm Dan Trussell, Sport PR at Loughborough University, and in this series of recordings we'll be taking a closer look at the topical issues surrounding a summer of sport in Paris. We caught up with Professor Jonathan Folland to discuss his research into what makes the perfect 100-metre sprinter. Professor Folland also discussed the future of the sport and how science can play a key role.
So we're sat here today in Hyde Park at Loughborough University to discuss 100-metre sprinters with an expert in the field. So Jonathan, I'd panel you just to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role at Loughborough University to start with.
Okay, so my name's Jonathan Folland. I'm Professor of Neuromuscular Performance here at Loughborough University. I've been here for 20 years doing teaching, research and consultancy in and around sports sciences.
You recently had some really important research come out which details some very interesting findings, shall we say, around sprinters. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Sure. So we did a series of studies looking at 100-metre track sprinters, males and females, trying to better understand their muscle morphology, particularly the size of their muscles, using a magnetic resonance imaging MRI scanner in order to measure the volume, the size of the muscles. And we found some really interesting things when we looked at the differences between elite, real top-level sprinters and sub-elite sprinters. So our elite sprinters in the males, they had an average PB time of 9.99 seconds, and in the females, the elite sprinters, their PB time was on average 11.14. So these are really top-draw athletes who've raced in global championships and in many cases won relay medals, etc. And we compared those elite sprinters to sub-elite sprinters who are on average about 0.5, 0.6 of a second slower. And we found some really clear, interesting differences in terms of their muscularity. Of course, when we look at sprinters, when you look at them line up on the start line, you can see that they're really muscular. But there was an interesting pattern to their muscularity. They were generally more muscular, but there was this pattern in terms of an anatomical variation in how muscular they were. So some muscles were very similar to sub-elite or even control individuals, but some muscles were way bigger. And what we found, some of the key findings were that the muscles around the hip, the muscle groups, the hip extensors and the hip flexors were particularly well developed in the sprinters. And then when we go to the individual muscles, we found 3 individual muscles that showed the biggest differences between elite and sub-elite, both in male and female sprinters. And those 3 muscles that showed the biggest differences were the gluteus maximus, which is the large muscle in the backside, the sartorius, which is a really long, thin hip muscle, and a small muscle also at the hip called the tensor fasciae latae. And I could talk a little bit about each of those if that's interesting. So take the gluteus maximus first of all. If you look at the gluteus maximus in an average untrained kind of healthy young man, you'll find that the gluteus maximus is about 900 grams in size. You look at an elite sprinter, nearly twice as big. So nearly 1.8 kilos the size of the gluteus maximus muscle. So really stark development of that muscle in elite level sprinters. And what's more, when we looked at the correlation between sprint performance amongst all of our sprinters and the size of this one muscle, it was consistently correlated with sprint performance. And it's the size of this one muscle seemed to explain quite a good chunk of the variability in sprint performance. Between 23% and 43% of the variability in sprint performance or 100-metre time was due to this one muscle, which seems like an amazing fact, given that we know that sprint performance is affected by a whole range of factors: nutrition, psychology, technique, all manner of anatomical and physiological factors. You know, various things have been suggested: the length of the toes, the size of the heel bone, the length of the femur, the thigh bone, the stiffness of the tendons. Many other factors have been suggested. So to find one single muscle, out of the 200 muscles in the human body, this one muscle seems to explain 23 to 43% of the variability in sprint performance was quite a remarkable finding.
So why would that be? Does it give the individual athletes more pace and more power?
Yes, well that's right. A bigger muscle tends to be more powerful. And specific to the gluteus maximus, it's the biggest of the hip extensors. And it plays a really key role mechanically in sprinting. So to explain that a little bit, when the leg comes through, when you swing your leg through during the running stride, swing the leg through, it comes through very fast when you're sprinting flat out. And the muscle group and the gluteus maximus in particular that needs to decelerate that swinging limb as quickly as possible to bring it to a stop, and then also pull it down fast to hit the ground quickly and go into the next step. That's the hip extensors, and particularly the gluteus maximus, which slows the limb down and then accelerates it quickly into the ground. And then when your foot is planted on the ground, again, the hip extensors and the gluteus maximus are crucial in driving that leg back underneath the body, essentially pushing the ground backwards and propelling the sprinter forwards. So the gluteus maximus, the hip extensors are critical to all of those really important actions.
And does this provide good news, perhaps, for your layman everyday runner who perhaps has, shall we say, a bigger behind?
Well, it depends what that behind is made of course. Is it muscle? Is it fat? Is it something else? A large muscular backside, yes, would be useful for running fast, no question about it. Yeah, if it's made of fat, that's probably not going to help you too much.
Let's just talk a little bit, Jonathan, about the exercises which athletes could do to enhance those muscle groups.
Yes. Well, some of the key exercises that are used to build the hip extensors and develop the gluteus maximus would be squats, deep squats, probably really useful. Lunges and hip thrusts are three of the more common ones. Yeah, and certainly with high load and probably done at relatively long muscle lengths, which seems to produce a bigger adaptation in the muscle.
And can this be adapted to other sports too, or are 100-metre sprinters, I guess they are a special breed?
Yes, they are to some extent a special breed. You know, there's a level of technique which you don't really see as much in, say, team sports athletes, soccer, rugby players, because they don't ever get up to quite the same top speeds for an extended period in the same way that you see 100-metre sprinters on the track. So they're somewhat specialist, but there is quite a lot of overlap as well. Being able to run fast is just incredibly useful in most team sports, soccer, rugby, hockey, etc. American football, and many others.
We're now kind of on the eve of the Paris Olympics and Paralympics as well. What can we expect from the sprint athletes out in France?
Well, I'm sure we'll see some outstanding performances this year. The women's 100 metres has been particularly hotly contested in recent years. It'll be interesting to see how they get on, and they've been kind of creeping closer to the world record, and so it'll be fascinating to see if anybody can get close to or even break that world record. And in the men's, I'm sure again we'll see some amazing performances, and really looking forward to see what happens this year.
And off the back of your research, do you believe that athletes will now be focusing more on those muscle groups?
Yes, I think so. So the work that we did was done in collaboration with British Athletics, so they're very much aware of what we've done and what we've found, and they've been taking that on board in the training they've been doing the last 2 or 3 years. And I know that other sprint groups and coaches around the world have seen the work and taken it on board to try and improve the speed of their athletes.
You touched on there how special these group of athletes are and how quick and consistently well they perform. Do you think, as a viewing public, we've been spoilt in the fact that we've seen the likes of Usain Bolt run super quick and break all the records in the book? Well,
certainly Usain Bolt was an incredible athlete, an absolutely outstanding athlete. You know, no one else has really got close to his world record. Whether anyone can this summer, we'll wait and see. But it looks unlikely at the moment. But yeah, he was stunning.
Do you think he'll ever be beaten?
No. Well, that's a really tricky question. Yes, probably over decades or centuries. You know, it'd be amazing if he weren't. But he was a truly outstanding athlete. Whether anyone can get close to that in the next few years, who knows? I suspect, I would suspect only with technological help, so shoe technology and perhaps other things that might enable an athlete to run as fast or quicker than he did.
And we've also had some very quick female sprinters. How close do you think we are to seeing somebody on that side dominate in such the way that Usain Bolt did and took the headlines and became that personality for the sport?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we'll see anyone dominate. There's been a cluster of runners who've been pretty similar and very competitive in recent years, and I'd expect that to continue. And I'm hoping we'll see more of the same on the men's side, actually. In the women's side, it's really exciting to see them start to kind of get closer towards Florence Griffith-Joyner's record from, I think, 1988.
So obviously this research was super well received. And what's next for you?
Well, one of the projects we're doing at the moment is we've looked at the muscle morphology of 100-metre sprinters, elite and sub-elite, and we're now looking also at middle distance runners and long distance runners. Now we know that they're not as muscular in general, but what we're interested in is the pattern of their muscular development. Are particular muscles relatively well developed and others not so much for running at middle distance performance standard or long distance performance standard as well. So that's one of the things we're doing now. We're also doing some work more on the plantar flexors, which are the muscles around the ankle, the calf muscles, and seeing how important they are in sprinting and jumping with some more biomechanical studies.
And are you expecting to see such big news come out of kind of your research? Are you expecting to see similar to kind of the glute story?
Hard to say. I think it will be really interesting to look at the middle and long distance runners, particularly long distance runners. We're expecting they have relatively small muscles. You know, they're generally very slim individuals, but the pattern of their muscular development will be really interesting, and we don't really know what to expect.
In this interview with Dr. Liam Heaney, we take a look at doping in sport. Why exactly is clean sport important? And how do authorities test to ensure integrity is upheld? And the proposed enhanced games? We talk about that too.
Liam, let's start from the very, very top. Tell us about yourself and how you got into academic research.
So I'm Dr. Liam Heaney and I'm based in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. And I've been working as an academic now for around 6 years. And then previously before that, as a researcher and a PhD student. I've always had a real big interest in sport, and I studied sports as an undergraduate and postgraduate student. And then when it came to doing my PhD, I transitioned slightly into the chemistry lab, where I continued an interest in researching within sport, but added in a technique called mass spectrometry, which is one of the mainstay techniques in analytical chemistry. Since then, I've worked within clinical research as well, using these techniques. And after returning to Loughborough for this current role, I decided to try and mix my interests together and develop more of the research using mass spectrometry, applying it more within sports research and building an interest in anti-doping, where the technology is one of the major aspects of the testing procedures.
So as a child, were you always interested in chemistry and sport as well, or was that kind of developed over time?
I think growing up, I was always a huge sports fan. You know, I followed football and rugby league a lot as a child, and whether or not the interest in the chemistry side was there at that point, it was more that I was always able to do well within sciences at school, and so they naturally converged together, and that's where I eventually came to study sport and exercise science. Wanting to work more within applied sport and use those scientific talents, I guess, to help sports people. Over the years, that naturally progressed into a different direction, because I found that I was really interested in the laboratory side of science, and that allowed me to develop the use of different techniques within the lab and understand how their importance within sports science research and more importantly, the wider field of sport.
Let's draw on a bit of that research and academic knowledge you have. How important is clean sport across the board?
Clean sport within our society and competitions that we watch on the television is really important, because we want to be able to see people performing in sports and different athletic competitions based on the hard work of their training, coupled with the talent that they have, either genetic or other learned talents. If we don't maintain that clean sport, then we're allowing an opportunity for a pharmaceutical or a different type of method to integrate into our sports and then produce a playing field which is not necessarily level in terms of physiology and performance. Also, we've got to remember that a lot of these ways that athletes don't stay clean, and by that we're talking about athletes who dope, many of these activities involve pharmaceutical drugs, other methods such as withdrawal and infusion of blood, and these can be quite dangerous if not performed and maintained in a safe manner. These drugs and methods are all developed for medicine and for clinical treatments, and not for the enhancement of an already very high-performing individual. And so the implementation of the anti-doping protocols both keeps the competition on a more fair stage, but also reduces the potential impact of longer-term health conditions and potentially even leading to death of athletes who abuse medicinal products.
With those risks so prominent, why would an athlete dope?
Well, there are many reasons why an athlete might dope. Potentially, from personal points of view, there's financial gain of winning competitions. That might be that they want the drive to have more and more money so that they can live the life that they want to live. But equally, it might be more of a personal, emotional way where the thrill and the excitement of winning overrides any other thought processes. And so the rationale of being clean, being safe, not cheating is overridden by that desire to be the victor and to be on that stage and to be seen. And some might think that as an ego to be the best in the world. Equally, we have seen over the decades instances of where people have been manipulated or pushed into doping, and that might be in order to stay within a squad or to be maintained within a team and competition status. And therefore they may be taken advantage of by other members of the team, such as senior athletes or coaches and other personnel within the squads.
Do you think there's been examples of certain individuals who perhaps become almost in denial to the fact that they're doping when they've been doing it consistently for so long? I'm thinking, for example, of Lance Armstrong, who was consistently at the top of his game, but by far means.
I think for those athletes that are on long-term doping strategies who may not have been caught for a long part of their career, will always have to start at a point where they tell themselves that they have to have the storyline that they are clean and they're not doping. And perhaps psychologically over time that becomes a reality within their own mind, because they've had to push themselves so hard not to let the world know that they're doing something which is against the rules. I can't imagine what that might be like for an individual, but possibly that is actually them telling themselves that they aren't doping, and they do believe that after a prolonged period of time of pushing it on themselves.
And how difficult is it for athletes to dope and to get away with it?
I think in the modern era, it's much more difficult than it may have been in past decades. This is owing to excellent advances in techniques within the laboratory, as well as increased surveillance and other techniques and methods used by anti-doping agencies to try to keep on top of what's happening within sport. Now, we don't really know the true number and true depth of how well those anti-doping programs are working, because we can never account for those that we aren't catching. However, I think at the top level sport, there is lots of testing, especially for those who are in medal places or within the top performing teams. And therefore, the chance to evade those testing procedures is much smaller than perhaps athletes who compete at the lower levels, where at the end of the day, the funding budget for doping control officers, for test analyses, is limited and it's finite. So without the funding to be able to go away and do hundreds of thousands of tests, then there's always that possibility that athletes will slip the net.
And is this just an elite level sport problem, or can this filter right down the sporting pyramid?
The problem of doping is throughout the whole sports pyramids. Perhaps within the media, it's most highlighted within the elite level, and perhaps that the outcomes and what happens to others is the biggest impact might be there at the elite level. However, there are many stories of doping throughout the levels of sport. And as you go into some of the lower levels, in certain sports, a lot of those adverse analytical findings, so the potential that the athlete is doped, may be to other reasons, such as personal use, recreational use of prohibited substances.
Tell us a little bit as well about the process of doping and testing. How would that work?
So in order to test an athlete to understand if they may have a prohibited substance within their system, or whether they may use a method which has manipulated their physiology to try and provide a performance enhancement, we will look to the athlete to provide a sample. That might be a urine sample or a blood sample. That sample is then sealed and sent to a World Anti-Doping Agency accredited laboratory, where it will undergo a series of tests which are either predetermined depending on a specific set of markers they're looking for, or maybe more of a wider spread screening process. So for example, specific marker testing we may do would be to look at blood cell levels to see whether an athlete may have manipulated the level of their red blood cells to try and increase their endurance performance. The screening tests may include an array of different anabolic steroids or other prohibited substances, where the labs will be looking for a clear yes/no whether that prohibited substance is present. Some substances may have a threshold limit where if below that limit, the sanction may not be then later enforced. And so there could be some tests as well where they would go forward for testing of their concentration within whichever sample medium has been provided.
And can you give us an example of a few rogue substances which perhaps aren't allowed, which would raise some alarm bells?
Yes, of course. So in terms of substances that are banned, the WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Agency, release a prohibited list which is updated once a year. And within that, there are many different classes of drugs, and there are different drugs that are sometimes only of importance within a competition phase, sometimes throughout the whole season training and competition, and also some that are only specific to certain sports. Now, drugs might be recreational in their use, such as cocaine or amphetamines, but also many of the prohibited substances will be medicinal products, such as testosterone or beta blockers, which people would be normally given for different health conditions. So, for example, testosterone is an anabolic steroid, which will help you to build muscle mass with training, and therefore that might give an advantage to an athlete in a power sport, such as sprinting or powerlifting. A beta blocker is what we call a calming agent, so it will reduce heart rate, and those sorts of drugs are banned within certain sports, such as archery, darts, shooting, to allow the athlete to be more calm and therefore provide an advantage, because they may not have the same impact of the nerves on movement, especially with fine sports like archery.
And how accurate are these tests?
These days, the excellent advancement in techniques and technologies used in the laboratory mean that the tests that are performed are extremely sensitive and extremely accurate. So when we do these sorts of tests, and within the accredited laboratories, they will have to follow very strict validation guidelines, which will need to fall within certain limits to be able to the test to be reliable and confirmed. If we do have those limits in agreement and we see these results that may be an adverse analytical finding, then the likelihood that is a reliable and true result is very high. Now, that's not to say what happens after that, for the reasoning for that result, where we go outside laboratories and take it into the hands of lawyers.
Excellent. There's been a lot of noise in the media recently about the enhanced games. We'll be interested to gather your thoughts on what you think to that potential spectacle and whether that's bad for sport across the board.
Well, the enhanced games is a really interesting concept, and it's understood from many of us within the field of the reasoning for why this may be an entertainment spectacle. Certainly, people are always interested in how fast can somebody run, how high can somebody jump, and what weight can somebody lift. But we need to remember that we can't do this at the detriment to people's health. Now, whilst the enhanced games don't necessarily encourage the use of prohibited substances or methods, there is a clear stance that those approaches will not be scrutinised and tested against, which provides the athlete with an indirect okay to go ahead and do that. Now, many athletes do or will or may have in the past used prohibited substances in a manner to cheat and dope and without major negative consequences. But there is an extreme risk for those athletes if they are to use too many of those drugs or too often, or those methods, where they could cause themselves longer psychological and physiological harm, and again, in extreme cases, may lead to death of the athlete. So for that reason, I don't think that having this enhanced games format is something that we should really be doing in the modern era, where we are conscious of our health, and we should be looking after and maintaining the health of those that are entertaining us in sport. I still think it seems a long way away from happening, but there is obviously a lot of noise in the media about it, and so we'll have to see how that develops.
And do you think, just away from that, back to sport, which is seen as clean, do you think there'll be an ongoing battle still between certain nations who abide by the rules and others who perhaps bend the rules?
I think there's always going to be conflict between different sets of individuals and groups within the athletic community. And for those that have poor reputations in the past, it's now on them to demonstrate that they can overcome that, they can become clean, and that they can compete fairly going forward. Now, that's not to say that the nations and teams that appear clean are entirely that way, but that's something that we may pick up over time as we learn new things. But I think that conflict will always exist, partly because sport is so competitive, and any advantage you can try and gain over your competitors, whether that be physical or mental, is going to drive those sorts of behaviours in certain individuals.
And finally, tell us a little bit about doping research at Loughborough. What's happening at the moment, and what are your hopes for the future, not just for the institution, but for you personally too?
So we're really interested in developing anti-doping science here at Loughborough University. I have colleagues within the school who are doing excellent work outside of the laboratory, where they're looking at the psychological impact of doping and the social impact of doping, that being both within the athletes and coaches, but also looking at the attitudes and knowledge of the wider population. Within our lab specifically, we are focused on the use of mass spectrometry as a laboratory technique. We're really interested in using smaller equipment than may be seen in the World Anti-Doping Agency labs, so that we can do very, very quick analysis that allows us to then also take the equipment out of the lab and to the fields. That might be that we take it to the stadium and we're able to do some sort of anti-doping analysis on the athlete sample immediately after a race, for example. For this, we're working with anti-doping agencies, other academics across the globe, and we have a dedicated PhD student at the moment who is working on developing those methods, especially within the rapid analysis aspect of this work. We're also working with the instrument manufacturers to help us develop new parts of the equipment that we can bolt on to try and help us with this, which means we may be able to improve the reliability and sensitivity of that work. And ultimately, we want to be able to build that cohort of work that will allow us to use that equipment in a very quick, efficient, and deployable manner.
In this interview, we speak with Professor Sophia Jowett to discuss the importance of a strong athlete-coach relationship. Prof Jowett tells us that if you get it right, it really can give you the edge on the global stage.
Sophia, thanks very much for joining us today. Let's start from the very beginning. Tell us a little bit about you as a person, how you got into academia.
Right, okay. So I come originally from Greece. I was born and brought up in Athens. And when I finished my first year degree at the University of Athens in the School of Sport and Exercise Sciences and Physical Education, I decided to do a postgraduate degree at Loughborough University. So I came here back in 1993 to study a master's in sports sciences. Having finished the master's in sports sciences, I was looking for opportunities to study at a higher level and looking for a funded PhD, a doctoral research degree. And I was very lucky and probably one of the first to receive an ESRC scholarship, a scholarship from the Economic and Social Research Council to study a PhD at the University of Exeter. So in 1997, I started a PhD at the University of Exeter with Professor Jeff Meek and Andrew Sparks. And I finished in 2001, where then before that, actually, 2 years before that, before I completely finished my PhD and graduated, I got a job at Staffordshire University. That was my first job as a lecturer in coaching behavior. And then an opportunity arose here at Loughborough University in 2000, which I was interviewed, and I was very successful and got clearly the position of a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology. So I am 20 years a lecturer and senior lecturer, reader, and now professor of psychology at Loughborough University.
Excellent. As a professor in psychology, obviously a lot of your research is in coach and athlete relationships. Tell us a little bit about why that's important.
Great question. So my passion for the coach-athlete relationship started when I was an athlete. I participated in athletics at competitive level. I started about at the age of 12, 13 years old. And I started with a great interest and being very motivated because my whole family comes from athletics. My dad actually went to the Olympic Games in 1997 and before that in 1968. So I wanted to follow his footsteps. So athletics it was. And I developed an interest in 400-meter hurdles, which I think was a very new event when I started in the 1980s. And I represented Greece as a junior athlete in several international events. I didn't quite make it to the Olympic Games, but I promised to my dad that somehow I will make it. I will make it. So my passion for coach-athlete relationships started when I realized the role and significance that coaches play in the development of the athlete's talent, whatever that might be. And I had 3 coaches in the time that I was an athlete, and one coach in particular made a huge impression for me because he worked on a very much individualized basis. He really cared for who I was as a person, and he appreciated so accurately why I was doing the sport, and I knew he wanted to help me to achieve my dreams and aspirations. And in fact, the time I was with him, I performed to the best of my ability. Unfortunately, he migrated to Germany, and therefore our relationship stopped. But it was at that time as well that I was becoming more of a national, international athlete, and it was time for me to move anyway from a club coach to a national coach. But yeah, my national career, international career was cut short at the age of about 20 years old, where I felt that it wasn't going really anywhere. So without regret, I left sport, having other now dreams and aspirations to fulfill. As I said, my dream was to finish my undergraduate degree that I started as an athlete, but I finished it without having the role of the athlete in me. I realized as I was becoming more familiar with the literature, the sports psychology literature, that the interpersonal dynamics, the complex interpersonal dynamics involved between coaches and athletes were primarily studied and understood through the lenses of coach leadership. And when you look at coach leadership, what you really focus on is at what coaches do to the athletes. But there is a bidirectionality involved and a reciprocity whereby the coach affects the athlete and the athlete affects the coach. And unfortunately, leadership perspectives at the time could not really capture that reciprocation that exists between coaches and athletes. And therefore, I introduced this idea of relationships in an effort to encompass the give and take that exists between coaches and athletes.
So as part of that, what qualities do both parties need in order for that relationship to flourish?
Yeah, so clearly we will all appreciate that relationships are very complex. They're not very easy to tangibly capture. So we did a lot of research, essentially part of my PhD and post-PhD, the emphasis was trying to understand what does that good quality coach-athlete relationship look like. And we interviewed hundreds of coaches and athletes in a period of about 5, 6, 7 years. And we were able to now pinpoint the ways that the coaches and athletes perceived that relationship. And because of the complexity and to alleviate that complexity, we developed a model that tried to capture that complexity through 4 dimensions. So we believe that we have really, in a tangible way, captured something that is quite complex. The 4 dimensions include closeness, commitment, complementarity, and co-orientation. Briefly to explain those, closeness refers to the emotional tone of the relationship and includes such relational properties as coaches and athletes' trust, respect, appreciation, and liking. Commitment refers to to coaches and athletes' willingness and intention to maintain close ties over time. Complementarity refers to coaches and athletes' interpersonal behaviors that are cooperative and include such behaviors as being responsive, being receptive, being friendly, being relaxed and at ease in each other's presence. And co-orientation simply refers to coaches and athletes' perspectives that are in agreement and align. So if a coach and an athlete have similar goals, performance goals and training plans, then the coach, the athlete and their relationship are said to be co-orientated. So this encapsulates something that is very complex and hopefully represents quite accurately what coaches and athletes have told us they perceive and understand the relationship with one another.
A point you raised there which got me thinking is in elite level sport often there's pressures to perform well quickly and to win medals, to win games of football, games of rugby, whatever it may be. How do you navigate the challenge of time where you need that time to develop relationships, but also there's a ticking time bomb there for you to get the results what you need to get?
Yes, a good point. And a lot of coaches ask me, how can we quickly develop that relationship that now everyone appreciates is important? There is not a magic wand that I can really, say, this is how you do it and you can do it quickly. But I think the key to every relationship is communication. The more you communicate with one another, the more you learn about each other's likes, dislikes, preferences, strengths and weaknesses. The more likely is for a coach, for example, to get under the skin of the athlete, understand them, what makes them tick, what makes them less receptive and so on. And by doing that, I think there are more the chances for better performances. And also, looking at the well-being of the athlete and how important it is for both the coach and the athlete. When you are in a relationship that you feel that you are understood and valued and respected, then you will be feeling that this arduous journey to performance, because let's not pretend, it's very difficult, it's very complex, and there are so many ups and so many downs. So the relationship allows the coach and the athlete to enjoy the process even when it is so arduous, so difficult, so challenging.
Excellent. That's really important and an interesting point. You talk about communication. How is communication used to get the best out of athletes and coaches too?
Sure. Now, before I answer straight the question, what I'd like to mention is a metaphor that I often use with my students to kind of marry the relationship and then and the importance of communication. So the way I see it is that the relationship that the coach and the athlete develop and maintain over the course of their partnership is a vehicle that takes the coach and the athlete from place A to place B. B for better place, hopefully. And communication is the fuel that activates, energizes that relationship and takes the athlete from A to B, and maybe quicker if communication is effective. Because communication is the cornerstone for effective coaching and successful coaching and relationships, of course. So yeah, communication is very, very important, and it can mean so many different things, from disclosing information to talking about all sorts of different things that concern the sport or the coach's and athlete's life beyond sport. Even disagreeing and having conflicts are part of communication, are part that are part of what is needed in order for relationships to grow and develop. But because communication is such an umbrella term that can encompass so many different things, we have developed another model that kind of helps coaches and athletes appreciate the key strategies, the main strategies that they can use in order to make their relationships more effective. So the model I'm referring to is known as COMPASS. C is for conflict management, O is for openness, M is for motivational strategies, P is for preventative strategies, A is for assurance, S for social support, and the last S is for social networks. So all of these strategies, if they're used correctly, and within each of these strategies, of course, there's so many elements and so many dimensions, then we can be certain to an extent that the relationship can be effective and healthy and functional.
We've seen, without naming names, we've seen big British athletes recently achieve great things and then go on to change coach quite regularly. Can that be detrimental to their performance and how they want or how they perceive themselves to be?
That's a good question, and I may know the case that you are referring to, but changing coaches very often is not a great solution if there is a problem or an issue. Some of the research does suggest that the longer the relationship, the better, because athletes in longer-term relationships feel more competent, feel more skillful, and they feel that they perform much better than athletes who are in shorter-term relationships.
And I know you're not close to Adam Peaty and Mel Marshall, particularly on campus, but that's a relationship from the outside looking in, which has been together for a long time, which has achieved fantastic things. How important do you think their relationship is in Adam's success?
Adam Peaty and Mel Marshall's partnership that, kind of reinforces the fact that long-term relationships are beneficial for long-term success. And actually, they're not the only ones. In swimming, we can think of Michael Phelps and Bo Bowman. They had a relationship that lasted for decades. And I can bring some other examples that I have been very close observing from the outside. A coach that has spoke about the role and significance of the coach-athlete relationship for performance at the highest level is Marcus Weiss. Marcus Weiss was the field hockey Olympic coach of the men's team in 2004. He won with his team a gold medal, as he did in 2008 with the women's team. And he is the first coach in the history who has won back-to-back Olympic Games with gold medals with a men's and a women's team. And I'd like to refer to his success because he has spoken about the coach-athlete relationship, and he has also cited the work that we are doing here at Loughborough University.
Do women coaches bring different qualities to male coaches, or are you just a good coach or a not so good coach?
A great question. And my view is that it's not whether female coaches have a certain qualities that may fit better for coaching, whilst men bring some other qualities. I think good quality coaching, effective and successful coaching, requires good communication, good relationships, good leadership. And I think both men and women are capable of offering these qualities. Naturally, one might say, women may be thought of as more empathic because they are brought up with that quality being very much as part of their socialization, about caring, about understanding, about relationships. You may suggest that males are brought up a little bit differently. They are more physical, empathy and caring might not be their priority in the ways that have been socialized, they have been brought up by the families, the school, the environment within which they're in. But the key point for us to appreciate that for effective and successful coaching, both sets of people, males and females, need to have these important qualities, good quality abilities and skills to develop good quality relationships, effective communication, and sound leadership.
Excellent. On the kind of the elite level stage, we tend to still not see as many women coaches as male. Why do you think that is? And do you think we can do more as a sports sector to create opportunities for women?
We know from research that has been conducted across the world that there are certain barriers for women to enter coaching, especially at the highest level of performance. Some of the reasons can be that sport has been a male-dominated environment, and women find it very difficult to penetrate that environment. But the phenomenon of fewer women at the highest level of performance, fewer women as coaches at the highest level of performance, is not just national in the UK, it's an international issue that we have. And it is interesting to see how the landscape of sport when it comes to athletes has changed, especially in the Olympics, where now we see an equal number of male and female athletes going to the Olympic Games. And I hope in the not so distant future, we can see an equal number of male and female coaches going to the Olympic Games. And it will take a little bit of positive intent, so that more women are attracted to coaching at the highest level, but also sport organizations invite more women into their sports.
In this interview with Dr. Verity Postlethwaite, we'll be discussing legacy. What exactly is legacy? Why is it important? And what can Paris do to ensure that it lives long in the memory?
Verity, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's start from the very top. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself as a person and also an academic?
Of course. So I'm Dr. Verity Postlethwaite. I'm based in the School of Sport and Exercise Sciences. But I recently joined the school as a Vice-Chancellor Independent Research Fellow. And that's a 2-year position where I'm looking to take what I did during my doctoral research and into the next stage of my career to become an independent researcher in a particular aspect of sport, business and society. So one of the school's 3 research themes.
Tell us how you got into academia. Were you always interested in following this career path?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and my career path into academia definitely was a bit non-traditional, and there's 2 sides to that coin. On the one hand, I'm very curious. I love asking questions. I love the underpinning ethos of research is to be innovative, to find things out, to discuss with people, to find solutions to challenges, all of that good stuff. However, I definitely am not a traditional academic in the sense that I wasn't always buried into books and excelling in school. I never ever thought I would be doing a PhD or currently doing a research fellowship. I've just been really privileged in some of the choices I've made and the decisions I've taken and some of the mentoring I've had to encourage me on this path. And I think I've really found a home at Loughborough, not just because my research is around events and a lot to do with sport and physical activity, but also because it is just such a vibrant research community. So being curious is definitely how I identify as an academic.
And one of the kind of the big research projects, or key research projects, I should say, you've been involved in is the Spirit of 2012. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and what exactly it is.
Of course, yeah. So the contracts and the research and the collaboration with Spirit of 2012 were born out of my doctoral research, which looked at the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games legacy to inspire a generation. I was either lucky or unlucky, depending on how you see it, to look at that in a lot of detail. And Spirit of 2012 as the endowment fund from the Games to ensure social and community legacy was a very key cog in quite a complicated machine of how we tried to use the energies, harness the enthusiasm from the London Games into longer term impacts. So when I came to Loughborough and took on this particular research fellowship, they were an absolute key partner. So we've been able to secure projects with them in 2 different ways. The first is looking to do a feasibility study of a capital of sport, so as similar to the model of the City of Culture, and whether that would work in slightly different ways to how we run events at the moment in the UK, in particular around underpinning an event around health and well-being, so taking us away from sport, which again, depending on what side of the debate you are, will be mixed feelings on that. And then the second project, which is just in the early stages, so I'm very excited about, is to become a learning partner. So Spirit of 2012 as an endowment fund will end. They will cease to exist in March 2026. So we are one of 3 learning partners here at Loughborough University, and we'll be looking to use this decade's worth of evidence that Spirit of 2012 have accrued through funding over 200 projects, spending around £48 million, and hopefully use all of that fantastic networks, evidence, energies to make it even more longer lasting. And it really fits with some of my research ideals, but also the principles here at Loughborough around what we want to use research for, which is to impact the communities that were on our doorstep, but also ambitiously around the UK.
Maybe the million-dollar question then, how important is legacy?
Gosh, that is the million-dollar question. For major events rights holders, such as the International Olympic Committee, the answer to your question is that legacy is very important to major sporting events. It's one of the key sources of justification to why you would use such large sums of money on a couple of weeks of an event, rather than investing that money back into other services that a community needs. For example, your health services, your education services, whatever it might be that's important to that community. Why invest that into an event? So an event needs to be bigger than the sum of its couple of weeks. And legacy has really taken off within the Olympic movement. So in terms of rights holders, the International Olympic Committee is the most important and the most dominant in this space, and the Summer Olympic Games is the largest of all of the major sporting events. So when you look back at where legacies come from, it started certainly in the 1990s to really take off as a formal process, and you had to have it as part of your bid. London 2012 was the first bid to have a legacy systematically put into the event life cycle, so it wasn't just an afterthought. And as we come up to Paris 2024, they are one of the first to put legacy into their bid as part of the new norm. So the International Olympic Committee isn't just saying to cities and to hosts is do legacy. They are systematically and technically getting down to how this can be managed and how positive event impacts and positive longer term legacies will be able to be evidenced and seen by some of the host communities. And there's a vested interest for a few different people there, but crucially for the International Olympic Committee is that it can get future hosts.
So how is that judged? If you look at London, is that within straight after the games, in the aftermath, once the dust has settled a few years down the line, is that when you see the real legacy?
I think you begin to see real legacy, interestingly, in the 2 or 3 years in the run-up to the Games, in terms of the planning of it. So legacy is split generally into 3 key areas: environmental legacy, social legacy, which is what I specialise in, and then economic legacy. Now, if we take economic, for example, if a Games is already overspending on actually delivering the event, those couple of weeks, and you know that the couple of years up to the run-up of it, then there will not be any money left to be spent afterwards. However, if a organising committee has ring-fenced £10 million or €10 million for legacy to be spent after the Games, then you would expect those activities to happen immediately afterwards and see how that would be sustainable into the longer term. So it's across the whole life cycle that you can really see whether a host city, an organising committee, and indeed the event rights holders is taking things seriously. They're just sometimes very good at massaging the media or messaging on the marketing of the event to sometimes mask over issues. So it's something that has to be said, is that legacies can be both positive and negative. Tangible, intangible, long-term, short-term. That's kind of the blessing and the curse of looking at legacy, is it can mean many different things.
Could you just give us a couple of examples of what legacy looks like in real terms, both for London and for Paris?
Yes, of course. In terms of real terms and social and community legacies, in London, there were a couple of flagship programmes that the London Organising Committee invested in and championed up until 2013, and then were able to hand over and sustain beyond the Games. So one of those illustrative examples is the Get Set programme. It was the official branded educational programme commissioned and brought about by the London Organising Committee, but it was handed over and sustained beyond 2013. It is actually still going. There is currently a path to Paris. That's been a combination of the British Olympic Association, the British Paralympic Association, the British Olympic Foundation and Spirit 2012. And that is a programme that targets children and young people with educational resources linked back to the social underpinnings of Olympism, so the Olympic ethos and the values of the Paralympic Games. What we're seeing in Paris is a slightly different management of their educational programme. And instead of giving money and resource to sustain beyond the Games, Paris have termed and used the word pregacy, in that they have pre-spent all of their monies from 2019 in their educational programme to roll it out across France in the hope, and I say hope in the I hope as well, that will carry on beyond the Games, but it is not clear yet who they will hand it on to and who will pay for the additional infrastructure needed as Get Set has happened. We could look at Tokyo and look at that in the same vein that they've used their educational resources. But again, Paris and France have done things slightly differently. And until we see years beyond the event, whether that will carry on, we can't quite say whether it will be as successful in terms of longevity as the Get Set programme from London 2012.
And as we're looking obviously towards Paris on the eve of kind of a new Olympic Games, will there be a legacy for Paris, or is it just lip service for the organisers?
It's a really important question, and initially to think about Paris now and whether it's just lip service and what it's doing in 2024, again, we need to look back to history. So this is the third time that Paris is hosting a Summer Olympic Games. It's also a string of major international sporting events that either Paris has hosted alone or as part of a multi-city hosting in France. So for example, the Rugby World Cup, the FIFA Women's World Cup, the Tour de France. Paris kind of does events well. The lip service and the interest at the moment is whether Paris can actually meet some of the lofty expectations and legacy promises it set out in its bidding documents, because the landscape of the world and the landscape as Paris has changed subsequently, for better and for worse. So for example, the cost of living crisis, the impact and implications of the Ukraine and the Gaza war on the sense of a global community and uniting to perform a sports event. The COVID-19 global pandemic, we're still understanding global society and some of the changes to that, some of the economic implications. And Paris had a really ambitious plan and an ambitious process. So some of these things that are out of their control, unfortunately, might hinder them in being able to actually reach, rather than it being a case that they were paying lip service, it's whether they can actually reach some of those targets and achievements. I would not want to be in their Parisian boots right now.
Could organisers also use, it's probably me being a bit cynical here, but could they use those major world events as an excuse to not delivering what they said they could? Or is that just me not being as trustworthy perhaps of those people?
I think trust is really important when it comes to the hosting of events, and that comes to the concept of hosting. Whether it's a local fete with a Loughborough community, or whether it's hosting 600,000 people at the opening ceremony on the banks of the Seine in Paris, you still need to have the trust in your host that they are being genuine, that they are being authentic, and that's the whole process of it. What I would say in terms of the conversation about economic, environmental and social legacies, unfortunately, history tells us and evidence tells us that it tends to be the social legacies that are neglected and that people don't keep their promises to. They are the easiest to push away or cover up or use a very big number. And London was part of that discourse as well. There was a huge target put on London's front and centre of how many people will become more physically active off of the back of the games. And in hindsight, that target should never have been set. And it wasn't necessarily that it was disingenuous or lying or people being cynical. It's just understanding what's possible and what can be managed and what is feasible within that location. As I said, whether it's a local community fete in Loughborough or the banks of the Seine in Paris, it's similar principles of being a trustworthy host.
So it's a really interesting point there, Verity. Let's just change the conversation slightly to talk about security at the Games. It's been in the news a lot. There's been a lot of conversation around security and the issues that France and Paris may face. Tell us how they're doing things differently, for number one, for starters, as the Games, and what threats they could potentially face.
Yes, Paris is facing a lot of threats, and that's to some extent not unusual, given the size, the scale, the level of spotlight on the Games. We know from some awful historical examples that certain groups will target a Summer Olympic or Paralympic Games for protest, for terrorism, for attacks. Paris has had to take this to the next level, as you quite rightly identified, in that they're trying to do things a little bit more open and a little bit more as though things are on the streets or on the waves of the Parisian landscape. So, for example, the opening ceremony, ambitiously, is going to be one of the first that is substantively based outside of a stadium. So whereas you would have had a security force that can bring a stadium and completely risk manage and understand all of the risks and threats and have as much procedure and protocols in there, the opening ceremony is looking to be across about a 7-kilometre distance of the River Seine, and it's going to involve about 600,000 people. There is no amount of risk assessment or money that can necessarily safeguard around such an ambitious project. And that's something that Paris has taken seriously, to the tune, reportedly, of about £320 million being spent on security forces. And some of the issues of even securitizing is finding that amount of guards or that amount of infrastructure to bring in. Which brings us on to the second, more hidden security issue that Paris is faced with. And again, in 2024, they're a host that unfortunately is not necessarily being able to learn from lessons in the past, and that's around cyber attacks. In the UK, we've recently seen some ginormous cultural and social cyber attacks, for example, in the British Library. And we know that Paris has also spent a significant amount of time, resource and energies looking at how to safeguard their cyber infrastructure. So there's all sorts of hosts of threats and security issues. And going back to some of our original conversation around the general climate of the globe, within France there's unease and there's been a series of protests. Globally there is unease and there's a series of public debate around particular conflicts or the way in which global nations, global communities are being governed. So it's a bit of a tumultuous context to be hosting in, and one that, again, the security has to have been front and centre to mitigate for some really horrific risks that could take hold.
And for something like that, is there anywhere where the French authorities can turn to learn from, or these are unique challenges, aren't they?
The cyber challenges are certainly unique for an Olympic and Paralympic Games to the extent at which they are there and the level of risk. However, as I've just said, there are examples beyond events where we can learn from previous cyber attacks. And Paris itself and France itself will have a national cybersecurity task force. So they will have borrowed heavily from that national infrastructure. In terms of terrorism, again, unfortunately, Paris and France have had a series of terrorist incidents beyond sport and in a sporting setting. So the Men's Champions League final and the Stade de France, there was huge issues with protest and security, which in some circles were seen that the spectators were the terrorists and that they were the issue, whereas UEFA and other bodies have looked into and investigated to whether actually it was the security forces and the way in which France and Paris had infrastructure. So unfortunately, there are things that France and Paris can learn from, but equally it might be they don't necessarily agree with how to securitize some of these areas. So throw into the mix that they're trying to do a really ambitious opening ceremony. The opening ceremony is a very unique setting, and that will be a unique set of security challenges, but they will be learnings from both within and beyond sport, within and beyond Paris and France, that they can kind of learn from.
Well, fingers crossed for them all. It hopes it goes as smoothly as possible. Let's chat a little bit again about major sporting events, so focusing back on kind of the sporting action. We've seen the Commonwealth Games has faced major challenges in recent times. Why do you think this is? And do you think as a Games, the Commonwealth movement has to evolve?
In terms of the second part to your question, yes, the Commonwealth Games has to evolve, it has to transform. And to some extent, it has been in a period of transformation, voluntarily and involuntarily. So again, your question about why the Commonwealth Games is in crisis, it kind of leads into some of the things that we've been discussing in terms of the cost of the Games and the ability to find hosts. So it may look fantastic on television, it may sound really grand in terms of numbers and the influence and the impacts, but there are only a handful of global cities and global areas that can physically take the infrastructure to put on a multi-sporting event, which the Commonwealth Games is one of. So there's some of those technical challenges. In my research, I take a slightly different angle on why Durban, South Africa pulled out of hosting, why Victoria, Australia pulled out of hosting in the most recent cycles, is it comes to politics and the actual origins of the event. So what we've really seen a shift in the past decade is the public consciousness of where some of these events come from and what they stand for. For example, the level of scrutiny that FIFA faced with the whole hosting process with the Men's World Cup in Qatar and the Middle East. The Commonwealth Games has faced similar public scrutiny around its connections to the empire, Britain as a coloniser, and to some extent the connections with the monarchy, which splits opinion. All of these are political considerations and political issues, which to some extent the Commonwealth Games Federation can tackle and can transform and can figure out where their place is as a sporting event, because it's really valuable to many communities. However, there are a number of people that are saying that some of these political considerations have too severe of an implication for any of the best sports authorities, sports officers to understand and to get beyond. So please don't ask me the question of where you think we'll host in 2026 or 2030. All I will say is, if the Commonwealth Games Federation can make it to 2030, it will be a century of hosting that particular games. And that century is a very rich colonial past of the UK. So let's wait and see who perhaps the next UK government is to make a more considered decision and answer of where next for the Commonwealth Games.
Do you think as a society we've moved on from that now? And do you think a rebrand, in kind of the ugliest terms, would fix that problem? Or do you think that'll always be, this is a new Games called X, but that was once the Commonwealth Games, which had all these connotations to it? Do you think it basically needs a complete scrap and a rebirth?
I think a rebirth and a rebrand of the Commonwealth Games would do a disservice to the complicated history it's built on. And I have to speak from an English, not a UK, an English perspective, because my memories and my connection to the Commonwealth Games, which I see memory and people's experiences as a really key component to any research question when you're considering these complicated matters, is growing up in and around Manchester and the impact that the 2002 Commonwealth Games had on Greater Manchester. So I'm biased. You could ask someone in Kingston, Jamaica, do you remember the 1966 Empire and Commonwealth Games and what it meant to Kingston, Jamaica? Possibly not. Would you be able to speak to Cardiff about when they last hosted? Possibly not. It depends on your connection to the event, your connection to the games. And I think the way that English politics, UK, British politics is at the moment, I don't think there would be consensus to what a rebrand and a rebirth would look like for the Commonwealth Games Federation, given the complications and the rich history that it's built on, let alone the territories and colonies that still identify with Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So unfortunately for the Commonwealth Games Federation, it's just in a very complicated moment where they will have to, if they were to rebrand and rebirth, it would have to be around a shared vision. So going back to the Spirit of 2012 partnership and the feasibility study for a city of sport, what has really captured and appealed in terms of branding and community building is basing an event on health and well-being, and the outcomes being about getting into open green spaces, an event being environmentally friendly, it being able to celebrate sporting success, but alongside what that can do to celebrate the other aspects of a community and the assets that it has. So unless they can commission the best marketer in the world to figure out the rebirth and rebrand, and I'm not sure that's possible, it's going to be a really hard and challenging road for the Commonwealth Games Movement Federation and indeed the sites that have hosted it in the past 100 years of history.
And my final point, Verity, is we saw recently UK Sport set out ambitious hosting targets for major events. So again, it comes back to that appetite. It's still obviously there. Why do you think this is? And do you think they've identified the correct events?
UK Sport definitely brought out an ambitious target and strategy around events in the next decade or so. And I think that there is very much a sensible approach to what types of sporting events they are targeting. For example, there is a significant amount of para-sporting events on that list because quite proudly, the UK is becoming a world-leading event organiser that can truly put on an accessible and inclusive sporting event. And that's based off of hosting previous events, but also more broadly in society, becoming more inclusive and embracing universal design. However, again, bringing a little bit more complication into it and perhaps a little bit more politics, you can tell where my research specialty and interests lie. There is a zeal in the United Kingdom, and UK Sport is at the centre of this, to distribute events across the UK. So there is a backlash against typical hosts, for example, Manchester, Liverpool, London, Glasgow. UK Sport is deliberately mapped out and trying to prove to its sporting stakeholders in the first instance that they are willing to back and make other places, and that can be towns, that can be smaller cities, that can be regions, ready and able to put in a very high quality and very compelling bid to the International Federation. Some of that will be successful. Unfortunately, some of that will also not be successful because some of those places just aren't feasible or aren't viable. But what I do back is the ambition from UK Sport to at least explore them. So a really illustrative example, archery. Very popular sport. It is funded by UK Sport because we win medals in both the Olympics and Paralympic Games and quite frequently at World Championships. The most populous area for participating in archery is the southwest of England. Please don't ask me why, but there'll be some wonderful history. However, there is not an archery range or an archery facility that could host a World Championships in the southwest region. So instead, there is a bid being explored in other areas of the UK, potentially a typical city that is well known for hosting events, not because it has a connection to archery, but because it can host events. What UK Sport is trying to reconcile and balance where some of our sporting interests and hotspots are with an actual ability to host some of these events and actually put the decision in the local community's hands, which brings us right back round to where legacy is most successful. And that is when the particular decision maker listens to all of these different stakeholders and beneficiaries and actually takes a considered decision to, should we host, who's going to pay for it, where should it be, and who is going to benefit.
Just on that, can sport learn from other industries? Like that kind of pricked my ears up a little bit. Thinking about Radio 1's Big Weekend, who tend to go to, let's say, the less desirable places, but sells out every time. So Dundee, Luton, Coventry, off the top of my head, these are kind of areas which don't get that action. Like how good could that be? Exactly.
I think sport and the sports sector, and in particular UK sport, can learn from other sectors that are very good at putting on events. So you've mentioned music there. We also have fantastic arts, which is why the City of Culture was front and centre in our feasibility study. But there are unsuccessful attempts to diversify beyond the different typical regions. So for example, the UK government spent a lot of public money on a huge set of cross UK events called Unboxed. And that received really mixed opinion to whether that distributing across different locations into smaller communities actually worked in terms of that bang for the buck of public monies. So where the pressure's back on researchers like me who love to ask questions and solve these grand challenges is how do we understand the value of taking an event into a non-traditional or non-desirable location and still capture the value it brings to the community and to the funder. And sport is behind its compatriots in arts and in culture for sure. But that is also why I really love partnering with Spirit of 2012, because they have championed that these silos need to be brought together. So they have funded across arts, culture, volunteering and sport, and that's something they're really proud of, and that's something I'm learning from them. So true authentic partnership isn't that I will just tell them answers or my views, is that I'm learning about what types of questions to ask and what types of communities to look at if we're to know more about how events can have long-lasting benefits and have the ability to host.
Verity, look, that's been a super interesting and engaging conversation, so thank you so much for joining us today.
Excellent, thanks Dan.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.